Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So we're very pleased to welcome this afternoon Simon Conway Morris, who's just down the road, Professor of Paleobiology here in the University of Cambridge, where he's held the chair of paleobiology since 1995. And I think Simon will be well known to many of us for his work, particularly on the Cambrian explosion, which we're going to hear about later on this afternoon, and indeed many other areas of Metazoan evolution. More recently, he's become also well known through his book Life Solution: Inevitable Humans and a Lonely Universe, which I just spotted not only on our bookstall in paperback, but actually at the princely sum of only £11. It started out as a rather expensive Cambridge University Press hardback, but the price is just coming down and down at the moment, so £11 for that I think is a really good deal. I warmly recommend that book, and I'm sure Simon will be telling us more about it. But he's going to start out this afternoon by telling us about addressing the question, is biological evolution inevitable? Thank you, Simon.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. Good afternoon, and if people haven't said welcome to Cambridge, it's actually quite nice here for once, but come in a week's time and you'll find the snow's up to about here. And thank you also for the plug for the book. In fact, you can get one even cheaper. I noticed on the marketplace here in central Cambridge, there's a second-hand bookstore, and you get one there for £5. So I offered to sign it this morning, but the person very kindly declined. Well, this is going to be a very short talk, should be relieved here, because as you can see, the title is biological evolution inevitable? And the answer to that is yes, so thank you very much. And should any of you perhaps want to sort of dally with such ideas, and I'm very happy not to debate them, but to crush them, such notions as intelligent design, then now, as they used to say in the good old days, when you were on American Airlines were reasonably safe, if your destination today is not Las Vegas, now is a very, very good time to leave the plane. And that's as well. So I will be talking about evolution. It happens, it's real. However, that may not be, as I'll try and explain, the entire story. And the other aspect, which is very familiar to myself as a paleontologist, of course, that I've been very fortunate to work in a number of extraordinary places in the world. I'll mention one of them in the second talk, if any of you are still here. There is only one copy of that book down by the marketplace, by the way. As paleontologists, we are fully aware, of course, that we are standing on a great heap of rocks, which goes back about 4 billion years. We have a pretty good fossil record, and in the Cambrian explosion, I think we're well on the way to explaining how individual body plans are constructed in an orderly and entirely unremarkable fashion, but that's for the future. The things which, of course, interest, I think, everybody in this room are twofold. First of all, as you can see, we've got a couple of sentient, if I can get this thing to work after fashion, a couple of those chaps on the top. They are chaps. Sentient species. Somehow, this mush of neurons here allows us to engage in conscious ratiocination, which actually, if you think about it for a moment, whereby lies a paradox, is totally and utterly extraordinary. And that's something which I shall dwell on very briefly, and I think there may be a few straws in the wind as to how we might progress that area. And then linked to that, of course, is we now know that there are more than 200 extrasolar systems. Practically every planet discovered is substantially larger than anything approaching the size of the Earth. Nevertheless, if you extrapolate the statistics of the likely planetary formation in unremarkable circumstances, then there will be millions, hundreds of millions, possibly even billions of Earth-like planets in our galaxy alone. And the likelihood, as I'll try and explain in a moment, is that some of them ought to have life in principle. Whether that's true or not is another question. But more particularly, if they do evolve, I'm as sure as I can be now that they will evolve sentience, and ultimately they should be able to engage in extraterrestrial communication. And there's some problem there, as you're all aware. Because unless, again, there are any aliens in the room at the moment, please put your hands up quite slowly if you have got a hand, then there's something there which really doesn't add up very well at all. So that's a little bit of the background. There's a couple of other just introductory things, and I'll be going through this material necessarily extremely quickly, typical Cambridge style. You surely understand it, it's simple. But more particularly because I want to cover a lot of ground, but equally I want to try and provoke your discussion, and with any luck, some dialogue in this area. There are some reasons to think, and I'm very happy to go into more detail if required or requested, that first of all carbon and water may be the universal building compounds or building blocks and solvent for life. There are other possibilities. And some people have even suggested, and I think reasonably, that in fact even biochemistry itself may be effectively universal, not only at such a level as here the iconic DNA, but possibly in a number of the other biochemical operations which we see. There's another aspect about the evolution of life which I think is important in this context, because even though not everybody, but the majority of people would still subscribe to the so-called carbaquist model of life, that is, one based on carbon and on water, and there are, of course, some intriguing alternatives which should not be neglected. Another aspect of this view would be that though life should be very widespread, making complex life, and here we have it in one sense in the Darwinian paradigm of, quote, the eye, is actually terribly difficult. Well, I'll try and persuade you for a number of reasons. I think that's very unlikely. But one thing which is less often remembered, and again, there's a lot of detail in this, is that most of the building blocks, including those we need for sentience and intelligence and nervous systems, actually evolved long, long before those complex organisations emerge. In other words, the molecular substrate you require to make complex things evolves principally in bacteria, or rather microbes. So if we look at the classic case of the eye, we know that the lenses, and in certain cases a cornea, which are transparent, owe their transparency to proteins which evolved for a completely different purpose, in a completely different context, and have been recruited. And again, any of you who work in evolutionary biology, and this is all second nature, but it's something which is occasionally forgotten. And correspondingly at the back of the eye, of course, we have other proteins which are responsible for the transduction mechanism, and thereby there's a very complicated story, including other things such as vitamin A. But despite all that, that protein has also evolved long before there were any sorts of eyes. So in principle, actually, most of the building yard is already sort of well occupied with things which you would require. Now, I'm afraid I got my slides in very slightly the wrong order. This is a small challenge for me, because this notion, therefore, that complicated things, especially something like ourselves, is difficult to evolve or may require very special circumstances of a so-called rare planet, has also invited a further evolutionary discussion as to the extent to which what would happen if we were to, using Stephen Jay Gould's very famous metaphor, to rerun the tape of life. And of course we can think of historical context of that. This is one of my favourite examples where things have gone slightly different in 1940. In other words, if the RAF had not managed to defeat the Luftwaffe, then in fact there is a very good argument, I think historically, that in point of fact none of us would be here, simply because at least in Europe our fathers in this country would have been deported to Poland and other places and ultimately murdered. I quite like this slide, partly because it's one of these sort of splendid indications of how to get it right, but also this famous quote from the Prime Minister, and sorry I never get the accent quite right, but it's roughly as follows: never watch out. And of course what was the joke there amongst the pilots was in fact that Winston Churchill, when he said never was so much owed by so many to so few, he was actually referring to their bar bills. And this metaphor of running the tape of life is something which would, if taken I think to its logical extreme, and I'll try and persuade you why we needn't do that, is that all these end products we see here, such as, and I'll show the slide in the later talk in a different sort of context, but including even hominids over there, or the chap in his underpants, in other words, on the far left, are evolutionary flukes of circumstance, no more or no less interesting than anything else we might have. Now, I have no objection at all in playing these sorts of games, and this is something historians do, I think, in a very engaging, and I think it's an intellectually worthwhile exercise, and I think it applies also to evolution. So you can see here the essay, in fact, which in this book called What If, where the discussion is what would happen had Britain fallen to the Nazis in 1940 or 1941. In a sequel to this, called More What If, there's another very entertaining essay by a Yale historian who inquires what might have happened if Pontius Pilate had released the carpenter known as Jesus of Nautilus. And in fact, it's a very ingenious exploration of a counterfactual alternative. So, given the cultural circumstances in which most, though by no means everybody, finds themselves, the zeitgeist being one of relativism, as you well know, not in terms of physics, of course, but in terms of moral authority, given the sense we're meant to be free agents, that we can decide exactly what we want to do, this historical resonance, or the evolutionary resonance of almost an infinite number of endpoints, is something which appeals across a very wide cross-section of people far beyond science. And what I'm going to try and show you is that's completely, utterly wrong. Well, Dennis again has already kindly given a plug, but knowing that there are a number of Americans in the audience, I suspect so, you don't have to put up your hands, and in particular, knowing how much I enjoy being in America, in particular because in America, as you know, you can engage in shameless self-advertisement and promotion, and here again I modestly draw attention to this minor. So in this book, what I'm trying to persuade people is that in fact something very much like a human is indeed evolutionarily inevitable. I won't be talking about that in any other detail, though I'm happy to again engage in discussion, but I rather suspect that we're alone, and that has not only, of course, scientific implications, but it also clearly has metaphysical implications as well, which might be of more than passing interest. Now, the notion about why we should assume that there is not uniqueness in biology, why we should assume that the number of endpoints, including ourselves, is actually surprisingly limited, would seem to fall at the first hurdle when you go to, for instance, Jared Diamond's essays, where he, as a mainstream neo-Darwinian, wants to argue that indeed evolution is almost completely open-ended. And his route to suggesting that something like a human, which would eventually understand electromagnetic radiation and ultimately develop radios or radio telescopes, must fall at the first hurdle, is by reference rather curiously to the woodpecker. But at first sight, being an ornithologist, he would appear to have a good point, because the woodpecker is an extraordinarily designed organism. I'm not an ornithologist, but I think most people are familiar with it because it has this stiff tail, it has this reverse claw here, and most remarkably it has this extraordinary sort of pneumatic skull which enables it to go at the tree like that, instead of falling unconscious from the tree, continues to Now, Diamond claims that this is biologically unique. Now, I'm slightly embarrassed to tell you here that in fact this is simply not true at all. In point of fact, something very much like a woodpecker, and I'll give you some other examples in a moment, has evolved 2 times more, maybe even more than that. Once in a group of birds known as the vangids in Madagascar, but more particularly in a group of funarids, the neotropical birds. And in certain species, funarids are a very diverse group of birds, I understand, but in certain groups the convergence, that's the thing I'll be stressing, of course, of the skull structure between this particular species of funarid and the woodpecker is almost precise, for a very simple reason. It does the same thing of trying to get insects out of a tree at very high propulsive speeds. And the more I think about it, the more hard-pushed I am these days to actually think of anything which is genuinely unique in biology. Almost everything has been tried. Now, this might be stepping slightly too far towards the end of the talk, but I think there's an interesting corollary to this, because not only would I dispute the fact that evolution is almost entirely open-ended, but also my sense these days is, in point of fact, it's not a question of things working, it's the question that practically nothing works. Almost everything out there is a total and utter failure. It's a very small proportion of biological organisation which is actually functional. Now, in the case, and again, if you're a professional biologist and evolutionary biologist, these are very familiar examples, but if you're outside the area, and I want to say a little bit, first of all, about convergence in the general sense, give you a few examples, then I'll go on to the evolution sensory systems, because that, in some way, presumably, is a channel towards sentience and intelligence. I'm not sure it's the only one, but nevertheless, it's a starting point. So, to start with this example here, we are mammals, of course. We belong to a group known as the placentals. Both the cow, if it's pregnant, or this girl, when she grows up and becomes a mother, will have a fairly protracted gestation period. There are 2 other groups of mammals, but the one I want to specialise on are, in fact, the alternative main group, the marsupials. And you may wonder why the father's looking so relaxed and happy. Well, he should, you know, because this is his child just down here. In the marsupials, of course, the young is born at a much earlier stage. There are all sorts of complications here. But by and large, they then climb out, well, after they're born, they climb out on the outside of the mother, more or less fuse themselves to the mammary teat here, and then only later become effectively free living as a joey, living in the diagnostic marsupium, that is the pouch. So here we have 2 very different groups of mammals. Here we have 2 very large and dangerous cats. This one coming towards us would have been seen around these parts of the world till at least 25,000 years ago. Correspondingly, this saber-toothed cat, as it is, with these enormous canines here, has a wide distribution across Asia and also in North America. And those of you who know the La Brea tar pits, for example, will be familiar with that wonderful museum. This saber-toothed cat here, as you can see, is slightly different, not only because we've seen it laterally than rather than from the front. You can see again it's got the large canine, but this flange here is not present in that area. And in fact, that protective flange is quite a good idea. If we look at the reconstruction of these 2 cats, and again, actually there are further complications in this area which are extremely interesting as to how they actually hunted and so forth, but I don't have time to go into. Both these cats are extinct. So this is one which lives in South America, and this is one which had a wider distribution, more in the northern hemisphere. They are strikingly similar, but as you've probably already guessed, or perhaps already know, there's only one interesting difference between these 2, and that is that this at the top is a marsupial, and this at the bottom is a placental. In other words, the one at the top is much more closely related to a koala bear, or a wombat, and the one at the bottom is far more closely related to a giraffe or a hedgehog than they are to each other. So that degree of convergence is indeed striking. Now, the vocabulary people use in the context of convergence is, in its own way, I think, interesting, because typically the words used are uncanny, stunning, remarkable, strange. But why? I mean, this is adaptation, nothing actually particularly strange about it at all. But I know probably you can imagine, begin to think where that disquiet might actually come from, though not perhaps in the way that it's always thought. Now, I should also say in passing that sometimes people get rather disenchanted with this argument because there are indeed significant differences, especially in the post-cranial skeleton, that behind the skull. And they say, well, really, you're making a false comparison. This convergence is not exact. But my answer to that, I'm afraid, is rather straightforward, and it is, effectively, that it makes absolutely no difference whether you're eaten by the cat at the top or whether you're eaten by the cat at the bottom. It really doesn't matter at all. No, it's not the way to go. So that's one example of convergence. Now, another one, which is actually quite interesting, again, I can't go into all the details because of the time, is that in this mammal marsupial placental convergence, we find a very intriguing parallel within the birds. Again, there's a lot of complications here, there's a lot of complications about the molecular phylogenies of birds, but effectively you have a relatively primitive group of birds here, which are sometimes known as the metaravians. They're shown on the respective left-hand sides, and you have a more advanced group on the other side. Now, I don't have time to go through all the differences, which are known as the coronavians. And let's just take this one, for instance, I and J as one sort of example. There we've got a tropic bird and a booby. The degree of convergence between these two is really very striking. I'll just give you one example. They're both tropical hunters who go after squid with flying fish. They have to hit the ocean at a high velocity, and to prevent their skulls being smashed in, they have these special air sacs, a bit like our air cushions in the cars, which protect them from the impact. Both those groups have evolved it. Again, from an adaptational point of view, what's surprising about it? If you're going to hit the ocean at high velocity, it's a very good idea to have those sorts of things around you. But in all the other groups here, things close to owls, things close to loons, things close to bitterns, things close to flamingos, things close to hudsons and so forth, we have this remarkable correspondence. And if you look at the relative diversity, that is a number of species you get in the placentals versus marsupials, you have very much the same arrangement here. And in essence, and I'm thinking about this from some other bits of work which I don't have time to talk about at all, when you keep on arriving at these forms, again, not identical, but, quote, remarkably similar, you begin to get the sense about the way in which morphology almost crystallizes into particular forms. And any one of those has an immediate functional explanation, which is entirely explicable by processes of natural selection. But it does, I think, reiterate my sense about the question as to how many things actually work in the universe we have versus the great majority which probably don't work. So that's another sort of parallel which suggests, and I think quite strongly suggests now, that there may be some big, deeper patterns of organisation in biological diversity. And after all, biology, the first approximation, is pretty free of rules and laws. It's not like physics and chemistry. We don't have a periodic table. We don't have things like general relativity. We just have an unholy mess. We have lots and lots of exceptions, apparently. But this sort of approach begins to say, well, maybe we can find ways in which we can formulate a more formal arrangement of argument. Now, in terms of other sorts of convergence, I just want to touch on two more examples because they are at opposite ends of the spectrum. By and large, because we're whole organisms and because we are vertebrates, examples like saber-toothed cats, examples like birds are moderately familiar. But in point of fact, the convergences can be demonstrated from the molecular level all the way through to levels of behaviour. And I'll give you an example of each. Molecular convergence should be extremely surprising for the simple reason that we have a number of building blocks in a protein, effectively 20, 21 amino acids. A typical protein might have 500, maybe more amino acids, and therefore the combinatorial number is gigantic. It's far larger than the number of elementary particles in the universe. You know, astronomers, let me remind you, deal with very small numbers indeed. Biologists deal with big numbers. Oh yes. So if indeed you found two molecules which were identical, and you knew beyond all reasonable doubt from other evidence, had separate origins, then actually I would stop believing in evolution, but of course we don't see that. But nevertheless we do see a convergence of a particular sort, which I think again is interesting in its own right, but also suggests that there's some predictability in the sorts of things we're trying to do. And again, biology doesn't believe in predictability, it just says random, mutation, random, mass extinction. And the example, I give you a whole lot of examples of that, is to do with an enzyme that's a natural catalyst which accelerates chemical reactions by many, many fold. And this particular one is responsible for dealing with carbon dioxide and its dissolved equivalent, bicarbonate. Now, carbon dioxide is effectively the storage of carbon on this planet in one form or another, either dissolved form or in limestone. To get hold of that, you have to use this enzyme known as carbonic anhydrase. And this is the sort of thing you have in your bloodstream. If you don't, you're going to be seriously ill quite shortly, because it deals with carbon dioxide from respiration. It also deals with the construction of bones. It's also used by plants in photosynthesis, because you've got carbon dioxide and water, which combine ultimately through a very complex process to produce sugars and oxygen, effectively. I would have thought, intuitively, that given that all life is carbon-based, probably all life comes from a single cell, once you've invented carbonic anhydrase, that's it. You keep on using it again and again and again, but you don't. In point of fact, carbonic anhydrase, this enzyme, has evolved independently at least 4 times. And the trick in the convergence is that little blue dot there, the single one in the top, 4 here and 3 there. These are 3 of the 4 types. And the convergence lies in the fact that in each case you're using a zinc atom, and it's got in association it amino acid residues, typically histidine, so that's not at all surprising, but there are 1 or 2 exceptions to that. So that if you want to deal with carbon dioxide as a carbaquist form, you will invent carbonic anhydrase. In other words, I think we can be sufficiently confident now to suggest that wherever there is life in the universe, it will be using zinc in that coordination as carbonic anhydrase. And I think, you know, as soon as you think about it, it's not actually terribly surprising. But that's the sort of thing which I think is sometimes slightly neglected. Let's look at the opposite end of convergence. Sorry, it's a slightly slow on the thing. Come on, there, so. That's it, well done. You can see why I took a bit of time to appear. If you consider the way in which humans get drunk, you can make a very interesting comparison to the way in which fruit flies get drunk. Why do fruit flies get drunk? They don't get drunk in the way that we enjoy a Bombay Sapphire with a little bit of tonic, not too much, that's most important. It's because they have to deal with a fruit substrate, hence fruit flies, which will tend to ferment and produce, as we do, of course, under controlled industrial conditions now, produces alcohol. So therefore they have to have tolerance to alcohol. So what you do is you take your fruit flies and you put them into a special machine, and I'm not joking, I never do, as you may have realised, known as the inebriometer. And this has got about 500 fruit flies in it, and you saturate their atmosphere with alcohol. And then you study how fast their legs move. And every time the leg moves, it crosses a light beam and that registers. So this here on the vertical axis is the speed of the legs moving. Now compare it to what it's like at a cocktail party, okay? Everybody arrives, we hope more or less sober. Fine. In fact, I have to the first drink goes like that, and a roar of conversation. So the legs are moving all over the place. But then there's panic, because the first dry martini's run out. There's no sign of the waiters. They don't seem to be anywhere at all. The conversation drops like that. But then, thank goodness, the second one arrives, and then there's another surge of activity there. But as more and more is drunk, at least in the case of the flies, the end point there leads to death. So in this way, this is nothing to do with the genetics of alcohol behaviour in these organisms. Actually, they're quite similar. It's to do with the behaviour of these particular ones. Once again, is convergent. So, when we're looking at the sorts of convergence, the final thing worth stressing, I think, is, and this is something which all biologists find extremely difficult, and I can quite see why, because I'm very keen on fossil worms, as it so happens, and that's what I spend my professional time doing, and they come again in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And you tend to be very impressed by just the sheer disparity, the sheer diversity of forms. And if you think of the octopus, and I'll come back to that in the context of the eye in just a moment, from H.G. Wells onwards, and probably before, I've checked what Aristotle wrote about it, but in terms of what would look most alien, then one would take something like the octopus with these writhing tentacles and all the rest of it. But even if we consider the tentacles by themselves, if you take high-speed photography of these tentacles, it turns out, in fact, that the musculature of these things operates in such a way as to form natural joints. Effectively, waves of muscular contraction move in opposite directions. When they meet, they define a joint. And if you then look at the definition of the octopus arm up here, in the blue, the black and the red, where those joints typically form, and there's some interesting statistics here to show there's a constant proportion between principally the red and the black level there, that thing is operating in exactly the same way as our arm. Yes, it is a short-lived hinge for a short-lived purpose, but the whole biomechanics of that, even though it is based on a muscular system which is completely unlike the muscular system of our arms, has converged on the same arrangement. This is a very nice paper. It was published in Nature a couple of years by Sombre et al. And they have a wonderful paragraph at the end, and you can see them more or less scratching their heads and saying, well, maybe this is the only way we can do it. This may be the optimal solution for this sort of operation. And that, again, needn't surprise one particularly. There's been further developments in this area as it happens, and it's not always as straightforward or as simple as this particular example here. But again, it's this thing of going below the skin deep, and I could give you a comparable example when, for instance, you compare the swimming activities of sharks, especially the lamelid sharks, and a tuna. There's a fine paper written by Donnelly et al. In Nature a couple of years ago, and the title is More Than Skin Deep. These things look superficially similar, but once you actually go down, the whole organisation of the thing is operating in a remarkably similar fashion. So then, let me just rattle very quickly through some of the fairly well-known examples of convergence in sensory systems, because as I mentioned a moment ago, I think this is important, because in some way, and we don't know at all in any detail, this underpins our operation of sensory modalities, and in some sense senses, and there's a very interesting work there in terms of various equivalents at higher levels, which in fact may be much more similar than is generally thought to be the case. So, we of course are descendants of the fish, and not surprisingly we possess the same sorts of eyes. That's the rule of thumb, not always, but the rule of thumb in evolution, and this is based on a so-called camera design. As I think most of you will know, in the squid, the octopus and the cuttlefish, the group of mollusks, which are called cephalopods, there is a remarkable convergence between the eyes of ourselves and the eyes of these mollusks. We know from molecular biology, we know from paleontology, we know from embryology, that these two groups cannot possibly be closely related, and we are beyond all reasonable doubt, in fact we're working on some of these fossils at the moment, that the common ancestor of these creatures could not possibly have possessed this camera eye. This animal here, the cuttlefish, of course, has a close relative to the oyster, and as most of you will know, in point of fact, one of our close relatives is the starfish, for example. So they both navigated to very much the same solution, and when we look at the details of the lens, for instance, again I don't have time to go on into all the details, but one of the important things you have to do is correct what's called spherical aberration, slight curvature of the light according to your impingement on the surface of the lens. And not surprisingly, if you do have spherical aberration, you will not have a finely focused image. If you ask a physicist what is the ideal solution, they'll produce that parabola for you, and you can see that both the octopus and the trout independently have arrived at very much the same solution. As it so happens, the proteins they use are completely different. And again, as soon as you stand back a moment and scratch your head a bit more, well, how else was the world ever meant to be? I mean, it's not actually terribly surprising, but it does again suggest that not only are these systems going to be convergent, but they will be convergent in certain cases in extremely sophisticated ways. So when we take a cross-section through these eyes, one sees that they are indeed strikingly similar. It is essential, perhaps, for a few people here to be reminded that in every case evolution has a footprint. In this particular case it's shown most clearly, but there are other evidence that the relative position of the retina in the central panel of the cephalopod, the octopus, is reversed in comparison with us. The reason that's perfectly straightforward, because the retina of that group is formed by skin sinking inwards, whereas our retina is a product of the brain going outwards. That explains why they have an inverted position in our cells. Slightly less well known is that if you go to other groups now, on the left we have a relative of the earthworm, it's a marine form. That too has also independently evolved a camera eye. The camera eye has actually evolved independently something like 7 times, including even in some jellyfish, and thereby hangs some utterly extraordinary stories. But the interesting thing is that these animals which possess camera eyes tend to hunt for meat, they tend to move fast, and they tend to be intelligent. So that's, again, not a surprising combination. But why that matters should be apparent when I show you this picture, because of course there are many sorts of eyes, there's more than 40, but the most principal ones are our camera eye, or the alternative, the compound eye. The compound eye, as you can see, is made of many lenses, is characteristic of the insects, but has evolved independently at least 4 times. The point about the compound eye is it does have some relative disadvantages in comparison with the camera eye. You can pack so many lenses on. You can make the lenses to a certain size but no smaller, otherwise they won't act as waveguides. And you of course have a surface which can only accommodate a finite number of lenses. And you can do a thought experiment, as indeed Kuno Kirschfeld, a physiologist who works in Tübingen, has done, to simply say, well, supposing, for the sake of argument, that God had forbidden camera eyes, what size of eye would we require to enjoy the visual acuity we do if we were forced to use a compound eye? And the answer is pretty sobering, I have to say. I wouldn't want to be in this sort of predicament at all. You'd actually need an eye possibly 10 metres across. And again, in the way that one has with carbonic anhydrase, I think there's a point of predictability here. I've made this point elsewhere in other circumstances. But if we're ever visited by the extraterrestrials, if the spaceship lands and the ramp comes down and they all come down with laser cannons trying to shoot you, if they're coming towards you with compound eyes, don't worry at all. They probably can't see you very well. But if they're coming towards you with camera eyes, you must run away as fast as possible, because they'll say the biologists told us to be careful of those people. And they'll also have things like irises as well, but that's another story if you want to be interested in that area. So the visual side, of course, is one which we accentuate because most of us regard that as our primary sense. There are, however, some very intriguing comparisons in terms of completely different systems. Again, I'll just mention these in passing. If you look at the star-nosed mole, for instance, the periphery of the nose is modified into this tactile set of tentacles which are extremely sensitive to touch. The basic neurobiology of that touch system, that tactile system, is actually extraordinarily similar to an eye. Ken Catania said this is a mole which uses its nose to see. And of course, as soon as you think about it, there's nothing very strange about that, because of course you and I aren't seeing each other, we're making interpretations of each other, and all of us get very quickly bogged down into sense perceptions, what the philosophical implications of that might be, and I think there are various ways we can fight our way out of that corner. But the fact of the matter is, there's no reason why any sense input can't provide effectively an equivalent image. And even things which to us look quite alien may in fact be far more similar to ourselves at that level of convergence than one might at first expect. And then if we look at actually the relative sense areas in this star-nosed mole, not only the nose itself, but also the forelimb there, are also heavily endowed with nervous tissue. In point of fact, in the star-nosed mole, something like 5 times as many nerves go from its small nose to its brain than go from our entire hand to our brain. So you can get some sense of what the sensitivity of that thing must be. It's effectively a tactile retina. Not only is it a tactile retina, but it even has a specialised area endowed with even more nervous tissue, which in our eye we call the fovea, and there's an exact analogue of that also in that mole as well. Even more alien systems of sensory perception, such as those which involve the generation of electrical fields. This is best known, though it's not restricted to fish. There are many such examples. One of the most compelling convergences we know of at the moment is that between the fish which live in Africa, the so-called elephant-nosed fish, I think the name's self-evident, and those which are found in South America, the gymnoted fish there. Both of them, again, is a long story here about many similarities, but both of them have effectively arrived at the same solution of not only living in an electrical world, but being able to navigate in total darkness, to be able to engage in courtship, to engage in recognition, even to jam each other's signals, which is something we find in an analogous way, of course, in certain cases with bats. And there too, if one looks at the basic sensory perceptions, there's no more reason to doubt that they are making their sense around them in just the same way as we are using our eyes, at what is fundamentally a very similar level. And that's also true, of course, when we go to echolocation. So, for instance, echolocation is best known in the bats, but of course it's evolved independently at least twice other. Once in the dolphins, they're shown in here, but also in the birds at least 2 times, in the oil birds and in the Asian swiftlets. In these sorts of cases, there's an additional level of inquiry, because at least in the case of the dolphin, there's experimental evidence that suggested in ways which we, I think, find quite difficult to comprehend. Somehow they are combining the visual information and the echolocation information into effectively what we would probably say is a single image. And that too is important, because when we then go on to the general discussion, which was put forward in a very articulate fashion in Thomas Nagel's famous essay, What Is It Like to Have the Mind of a Bat?, which I think to some extent restarted the interest in consciousness, and of course I think to the first approximation, along with the study of the origin of life, that is a total graveyard of ambition. You've got a really clever young person, and he goes up to you and says, I'd like to waste my life, what can I do? You say, go and work on consciousness. If they think they're going to get to the answer in the way that some of my distinguished colleagues are attempting to achieve, they may be right, but I think they're not going to be very successful. But Nagel's argument was that effectively we cannot know the mind of the bat. It is utterly alien. It is completely different to us. It's based, as I say, on echolocation and the like. And therefore it will remain entirely unknowable. And that actually is not so far removed in a way from Colin McGinn's argument to do with consciousness, if I understand them correctly, which is that in a sense, and this is actually, I think, echoed in Nagel's own essay, that it's actually beyond our comprehension. There is a neural substrate which in a sense does not allow it to understand itself. And they may be right. They could well be right, but I'm not sure that's going to be the case either. But at least from the perspective of convergence in evolution and the convergence of sensory systems at various levels, there is some reason to be optimistic that we are basically talking about the same thing. We don't know what that same thing is, but nevertheless it is not completely different. And this applies, I don't have time to go into this area, there's a group of heretics at the moment who are talking quite seriously about chemical communication in plants, and if I have to remind you that a good part of our brain activity is not electrical, it's chemical, then one can step back slightly and say, well, are you so sure that plants aren't conscious? Of course they're not in the sort of Prince of Wales tree-hugging way. I'm not thinking in that sort of new age stuff, you know, I love my oak tree and that sort of business. But it may well be, and we already have some information about that, in terms of the exchange of information between plants, for instance when they're being attacked by predators, that possibly we should just stand back very slightly and, dare I say, be a little bit more imaginative. So that's one aspect of what may be leading convergence in one set of directions. Come on, a little bit slow. It's back. It's going to have the mouse for dinner. They don't want to see the next slide, do they? Everyone look away. Try that one again. There we go. One other aspect of neo-Darwinian thought, in addition to the notion of, quote, woodpeckers being unique, and therefore, in final analysis, everything being unique, which has been very much a theme of discussion, and one which has been articulated especially clearly by the late Stephen Jay Gould, is the importance of mass extinctions. Because why do we know that this diagram here is impossible? And I should say, in parenthesis, very unfairly, I call this the degree ceremony, the graduation ceremony in Oxford. Yes, yes, look at all those dinosaurs, there they are. You know who that is? That's right, he wrote a book recently and sold very well. That's right, yes, very good. We know that the dinosaurs weren't domesticated simply because 65 million years ago on a June day some clown dropped a large rock on the sky, and perhaps some of you saw the paper in Nature the week before last arguing we now know basically when the asteroid was formed as part of a wider collision event something like 60 million years before the impact itself. And this led to the disappearance of all the great reptiles, not only those on the land, the dinosaurs, but also those in the seas, things like mosasaurs, and also those in the air, the pterosaurs. And therefore, briefly going back to our bat, as Gould and many other people have pointed out, that would have denied forever, if the asteroid had missed, the ecological opportunities which are then seized by the mammals and also the birds. So we wouldn't have had the sky being reinvaded by the flying mammals, the bats, nor would we have the oceans reinvaded by the cetaceans, and I'll come back to them in another moment with regard to the dolphins, nor, of course, would we have had the evolution of the great apes. Now, the horrible thing that's going to appear in a second. So their history seems to have been completely diverted into a completely new direction. And if indeed the primates hadn't managed to radiate, and thereby the great apes, and thereby us, that direction of evolution would have been forever forbidden. Now, I think historically that is superficially correct, but I think in the longer term it's most unlikely to be correct. And the reason is that we can still engage in counterfactuals. And on this planet, and I think all Earth-like planets, you're going to have ice ages for various reasons, and mostly linked to greenhouse gases, effectively. So imagine the asteroid misses. We go into an ice age, so what happens? The temperate and the polar zones are much cooler. They're the sorts of places where warm-blooded organisms, they're called birds and mammals, by the way, which coexisted with the dinosaurs, are going to begin to radiate. The tropics remains full of dinosaurs, that's okay, they like it, so do snakes and lizards today. The tropics are poaching with those reptiles. But, as I'll show in a moment, because these socially adept, warm-blooded forms have an ability to invent independently technology, and amongst that is also a craving for protein, then I'm afraid the mass extinction of the dinosaurs will be getting underway about 30 million years behind schedule. It'll be a different sort of mass extinction, but it's basically equivalent to the mass extinction which went on in Australia and South America in particular, led to the destruction of the large mammal faunas, to some extent in Africa as well. Now, when we consider the birds, it's now becoming quite clear that the degrees of convergence between themselves and ourselves are much more exact than had been thought. I start, of course, with this slide. You'll all recognise it straight away because there aren't many places in the world where you get penguins and horses living together. And this, of course, now I want all the English here to put their hands on the heart at the same time. Thank you very much. This is the Falkland Islands, very important too. And in the case of the birds, they have independently involved warm-bloodedness of ourselves. They're, of course, effectively feathered dinosaurs, so it appears. The molecular mechanisms are very similar but not identical. But it is arguable that if you want a large brain, if you want a stable body state, then you really need to have a very precisely controlled temperature. And you need to elevate that temperature as well so you can have reasonably fast chemical reactions. Another thing which is now clear is that not only have birds learned to vocalize and sing at least 3 times themselves independently, but the neurobiology and also the process of how they learn to sing is remarkably similar to the way in which we learn to speak. They don't have language, that's a slightly different point, but nevertheless it seems that there's probably only 1 or 2 ways. If you're going to sing wherever you are in the galaxy, odds are you may end up singing much as we have to sing and the birds. Correspondingly, this is something which has only become clear in the last few years, something which is very widespread amongst the mammals, something which we take for granted, but in fact is, again, from one perspective very strange, is what's called social play. Now, if you look at the more intelligent of the birds, especially the crows, and here a high-altitude parrot, this is known as the kea in New Zealand, these show a one-to-one match in the categories of social play which we recognise in the mammals. So, for instance, we have tug-of-war, we have mock wrestling here, and the kea is particularly interesting because as young they go around as delinquent gangs, trashing things, and here you can see them dismantling an armchair. They also like taking cars to pieces. The ideal is to actually take out the rubber here, and then if possible, if the window falls in, then they jump into the car and continue to trash the interior of the car. And for some reason I can't put my finger on there, rather unpopular in New Zealand, I don't quite know why, but there they are. But this social play is convergent on our social play. And in particular, why that matters I think will become clear in a moment, because there's one other context I need to mention. And that is that in addition to those convergences, we also now have compelling evidence for convergences in tool making. In the New Caledonian crow in particular, here in the wild they use these probes to extract insects, and they also make hooks there. This tool making is substantially superior to anything which a chimpanzee can do. And it's just been shown, I haven't had time to read the paper, that in certain circumstances the New Caledonian crow uses one tool against another tool to achieve its purpose. And why this matters is you can see we've got here the stripping out of these pandanus leaves to produce these successive probes, and if I have the slides in the right order, I think I do it on a click shot. These are successfully modified to produce, let me try that again, sorry, there we go. Yeah, thank you. These are successfully modified for different functions. That's a proto-technology. And then if you consider the sort of tools we were making 2.2 million years ago at the beginning of the older worm cultures, it's not entirely clear to me that they're very much more sophisticated than these. And this, again, has been arrived at completely independently. So why does all this matter? It matters, first of all, because it seems that the cognitive landscape which the crows, in this particular case, and also the parrots are building for themselves, which can be divided into such things as imagination and causal reading and flexibility, really maps very closely indeed with the apes. There's some very interesting work being done here in Cambridge on especially the scrub jays. So I need to go back. I think I've lost a couple of slides, I'm sorry. The other thing which is not clear, and I'm sorry, I'm not too much of a rush when I get these things together. The other thing which is, nope, never appeared. The other thing is that if you look at the brain structure of the bird brain, it is completely different, for all intents and purposes, to the bird structure of the mammalian brain. In other words, we have effectively a laminar structure, whereas the birds have what's called a nucleus structure. It's a nucleate-like structure. And there's been a lot of attempt, first of all, to find homologies between the two sort of brains, and that's not been very successful. And in addition, it was then thought, well, maybe birds are effectively sort of piling one reptile brain on top of another, and that's also not correct. So what this means is, and I think this is very important, is that the cognitive landscape which emerges from the bird brain is indistinguishable from ours, and yet it comes out of a different sort of brain. And then you have to step slightly backwards and say, well, that's all fine. I mean, brains do thinking, don't they? But it's not quite clear whether they should have the same cognitive landscape. But you can then stand slightly back further and say, well, where exactly is this, quote, landscape coming from? And again, you can understand that we're beginning to touch on the rather tricky area of what is consciousness. And it may well be that there are particular molecules which simply allow you to be conscious. That'd be a nice idea. I'm not quite sure what they look like, but nevertheless, that's an idea worth playing with. And if those molecules are in common, that's fine. We've solved the problem. But you'll see, I think, that that sort of regressive argument leads you into, I think, some pretty implausible corners without a great deal of trouble. So there are those aspects about the convergence between ourselves and the birds which I think are relatively understated. and in a way analogous to the octopus arm and our human arm, or octopus tentacle and our human arm, actually point at a deeper similarity. Now, to move on very quickly, there are other aspects about convergently cognitive states which at first sight might seem to be less surprising, but in point of fact, I think in their own way are more compelling. More intelligent birds do tend to have somewhat bigger brains, but oddly enough, flightless birds, things like an ostrich, is by some people's estimation one of the dimmest animals on the planet. You know, just because you chuck away your wings and don't have to worry about body weight, they do not get disproportionately large brains. It has also been claimed, especially by Stephen Jay Gould, but others, that this increase on our own brain size from around about 6 million years ago, here effectively shown with an Australopithecine and then Homo erectus and then ourselves, is a unique evolutionary trajectory. And again, this is important because it's an echo of the woodpecker argument. It says, well, sure, we end up with this colossal brain at the end of the day, which allows us to do things like string theory or write poetry. But as Gould himself would have said, this is all a spandrel, this is all a glorious accident. You know, it's interesting we can do these things and we should be pleased that we can actually study evolution, but there's no intention in that. And of course there's no intention in it per se. I don't think there would be for a moment. But it's not the case to begin with that this increase in brain size is unique. In point of fact, if we look at the toothed whales known as the dolphins and the porpoises, it turns out that their increase in brain size was achieved substantially earlier than our increase in brain size and has been maintained for perhaps 15 million years. Why do I use the word maintained? Because the brain is effectively an evolutionary disaster. Nobody in their right mind would invent a brain. It sucks up energy at an extraordinary rate. Well, not only does it suck up energy, all of you had lunch, those of you who did have lunch, would be using 20% of your lunch to get 2% of your body mass going. So it's not the sort of thing which one would normally invest heavily in. So if we see the increase in the brain size of the hominids, shown in the red dots there, you can see that in point of fact, only about 1.5 million, let me get this thing quite to work, only about 1.5 million years ago, that's, the thing has got a light in its own now, and I'll keep on flashing on and off. I want you to look at that point there, Mr. Williams, thank you very much. Did the dolphin brains actually, did the human brains actually pull beyond the dolphin brains? Before that, they were the animals with the biggest brains on the planet. Is that interesting in terms of convergence? It most certainly is, because they show, again, all sorts of similarities in their cognitive landscape. Rather surprisingly, despite the fact they don't have hands, they can use tools. This is a female dolphin in Shark Bay, and it and its daughters learn how to put sponges onto the front of their rostra, probably to provide defence when they're grovelling around in the gravel after food against such poisonous things as sea snakes and stonefish and things like that. And more particularly, when we look at the entire cognitive world of the dolphins, epitomised here in this playfulness when they blow these sort of bubble rings through their blowholes here, with their ability to memorise things, their ability to communicate, their ability to recognise themselves as mirrors, which we'll come back to in a moment. There's every reason to think that these animals are not only highly intelligent, but again are occupying a cognitive space which is very similar to the apes and to the crows. And you might then stand back reasonably and say, well, so what? They're mammals, aren't they? Well, I'm not so sure, because after all, you know, crows and apes live in trees, and you could imagine them making a cognitive world which is broadly arboreal. Whereas if you're living in an ocean, in a completely buoyant environment, where you depend very largely on echolocation, you might say ab initio we would end up with a different cognitive landscape, but we don't. Once again, we end up with something which is very similar. Now, there's one other aspect about animal cognition which I just want to touch on for a couple of minutes, which again I'm finding very intriguing, before I go on and quickly finish at 3 if possible, Dennis, yes. And that's to do with the elephants. Now, the elephants are very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, their trunks are effectively the answer, perhaps, to their intelligence. Because it may be that because they are so manipulative with their trunks, this extended nose, that might be the trigger to their cognitive exploration. And although there's much emphasis in terms of human evolution on cognitive superiority emerging through social interactions within the horde or the group, there's as much reason to think that the spur towards intelligence is to do with the manipulation of tools and other objects. So that's one interesting point. The other thing, just in passing, is that if you look at the kidney structure of the elephants, so I'm told, it's strongly indicative that the elephants had an aquatic ancestry. And why, therefore, did they have trunks? Because the trunks initially evolved as natural schnorkels. So that, again, I think it's a very real possibility. But when we go and look at the elephants, there are a whole series of interesting aspects about them. They use tools. Here we have them using fly whisks to keep off parasitic flies, and that's no joke. Those flies will take litres of blood. And the great advantage of these tools, both by the baby here and the female here, is that once you've used the tool, you can eat it, which is relatively convenient. And also, they are capable of mirror self-recognition. Once again, from the human perspective, this is something we take completely for granted, but it's quite, and if you live with animals, it's generally a little bit more familiar, but it's quite difficult to understand, you know, the leap which we take entirely for granted. Of course, you need an elephant-sized mirror. But what you have here is you put a marking on the elephant there, which you have every reason to think it can't smell or otherwise recognise. And then you see the elephants beginning to investigate themselves, and this is the moment where it dawns on them that there's not another elephant behind the mirror or anything like that. That's me. But bonobos, possibly parrots, dolphins, elephants ourselves, is a very small list. But again, you could see from the point of view of cognitive understanding, if you're starting to move into new worlds, which clearly we're doing now, and this is one aspect which from our perspective is, you know, natural and simple, but seems to involve something connected to intelligence, but there may be something beyond that as well. And the other thing about the elephants, which is very interesting, is that very unusually, there's some evidence from dolphins as well, they have a curious fascination in their own dead. Not any old bone, but especially the ivory, as well as the bones of the elephant. And in addition to that, their reaction both to the death of their young and also the matriarchs. This is a matriarch in the process of dying in Uganda, and there's a sequence of photographs from this paper showing the other one trying to lift it up and so forth. The curiosity, the interest, and what for want of a better word we would call grief associated with the clan behaviour, not only of the immediate clan, but sometimes unrelated clans, is again something which, you know, from our perspective, you know, it is awfully familiar. But it seems to be effectively arrived at independently by at least one other group. So, quickly to conclude, what would be a tempting possibility, I don't know if it's actually going to work out this way, is to say, well, yes, this is all jolly fascinating, at least I hope you find this interesting, but there's still no doubt, as I think is epitomised in this picture here, you know, what other species would regard this as a sensible thing to do? You know, you have to give it, I mean, again, because we're so embedded in what we regard as the natural world around us, it's sometimes easy to forget how extraordinarily strange we are. We're most peculiar. So dropping out of balloons is regarded as fun by some people. And the notion would be that maybe there is, you know, a genetic change which makes us human. Well, France may, in fact, have evidence of that. I'm not aware of that. Maybe there's one particular, you know, polysaccharide in the brain which just tips us over in a particular direction. But I think there's evidence against that. And the lines of evidence really come from two areas, and then I'll finish. The first is to do with the Neanderthals. The Neanderthal there on the left is almost certainly a separate species. By and large, the Neanderthals, which died out around about 25,000 years ago, have been regarded as runners-up. However, they had, if anything, a slightly larger brain than ourselves. They also had precision grip. There we've got a Neanderthal finger and thumb coming together, and that's not very surprising because we know that they had tools. We know that they made fire. They almost certainly had clothing. And in addition, as I'm sure most of you are aware, curiously, they buried their dead. Now, of course, it's a complete matter of speculation why they may have done that. But in fact, the oldest hominid burials are Neanderthal, not Homo, as it so happens. This is the famous burial from Gabara in Israel, and the skull itself has been removed. Again, for what purpose? If any purpose, we have no idea at all. But as I said, the Neanderthals are extinct, and the general idea is that they failed either because of climatic conditions. There's a paper in this week's Nature discussing that, one of my friend Cronus in Leeds, or possibly due to interaction with Homo sapiens. And some evidence for interaction with Homo sapiens might come from the fact that shortly before the Neanderthals do disappear, and the Neanderthals are effectively a European species, they undergo this remarkable cultural revolution, which is sometimes referred to as the Chateauperonian cultures. These are teeth and bones of fox and other animals which have been drilled or incised, and although they've not been found like this in situ, were most probably some sort of necklace. The common understanding has been that this cultural revolution, which is undoubtedly in the hands of the Neanderthals, was the result of contact with Homo sapiens, which was moving in from the Levant and other areas of Near Asia. That may be true, but there is another possibility which is based on controversial work on radiocarbon dating, on cave stratigraphy, and also preceding Neanderthal cultural types, to suggest that this Chateauperonian culture was arrived at completely independently of ourselves. Now, once again, it's a little bit like the elephant mirror self-recognition. because we're used to so-called extra, so all of us are wearing clothes for all, obviously we're hiding our nakedness, that goes without saying, but we're choosing our colours, we're very often making deliberate things, either to make the paunch very, very slightly smaller, or sometimes very much larger, but one's dealing with things where you're communicating all the time aspects about yourself, your status and all the rest of it. That is something which is happening to the Neanderthals. Now, if that is happening independently, whatever that necklace was used for, whether it's for sexual attraction or shamanism, who knows, we have not the foggiest idea. That's the sort of idea that you are going to end up with highly advanced cultural states independently. I'll skip that, we may come back to that if necessary in any discussion. The other straw in the wind, which is very interesting, is that as in any area of science, again and again, just when you think everything's sorted, the textbook's just gone off to the press, something totally surprising turns out. This is again quite well known, I'm sure, to the majority of you. Here, of course, we have the Indonesian archipelago, and as I'm sure all of you know, in this little island Flores here, there have been the most astonishing discoveries in the form of a diminutive hominid, nicknamed Hobbit, being something in the order of a metre in height. And this diminutive hominid, Homo floresiensis, everything hunted, everything had fire, lived from at least 100,000 years ago to possibly as recently as 12,000 years ago, coexisted with Homo sapiens, but the brain size is smaller than that of a chimpanzee. Now, this does not make sense at all from any way you look at it. There's been a great deal of discussion as to whether the brain structure, which is being preserved here in the so-called endocast, is effectively human, whether it was capable of cognitive sophistication. But both the tall cultures, if they're correctly identified, and the structures within the brain indicate that that is the case. But on the other hand, if you do the calculations on a brain size of that diminutive nature, it simply can't do that sort of thinking. So something here is not making any sense at all. But the straw in the wind may be as follows, and there's no more than that, and this is where I'll conclude you'll be relieved to hear. Because again, it steps back to where is our consciousness resting. Now, of course, as you know, the received wisdom, and it may well be correct, you know, science is very good at proving things like this. But on the other hand, when science has trouble over many decades, one is entitled to say, well, maybe the question, at least in some way, has got to be reformulated. But to think of the convergence in the context of singing, I mentioned that within the birds. Now, singing has evolved independently in a whole set of birds. Did you know, for instance, purring, another sort of vocalization is convergent? Oh, yeah, some monkeys purr, sort of cats, there we go. But in the male humpback whales, they too are famous for their singing. Some of the singing can be heard over very substantial distances. Now, the convergence can be explained simply in terms of the physics of sound production, vibrating columns of air, by and large. But there is an essay by Patricia Gray, who's a musicologist in Science, published I think it was in 2002. And she says, well, that's all fine and large, and I'm quite prepared, if I remember her argument correctly, that that's part of the argument. But we can actually look at the convergence of singing in a completely different context, and simply say, well, the reason why the singing is the same, the reason why it's music, the reason why it's got melody and harmony, has inversion, has all the aspects which we regard as interesting and beautiful and worth listening to, even amongst animals, is in point of fact that there is, quote, a universal music. In other words, there is universal music out there, and evolution is simply a search engine. The reason why you converge is you keep on ending up in the same arrangement, because that arrangement has been there all the time. Now, if that applies to music, then in principle I don't see why it doesn't apply to consciousness as well. And you can see at that perspective, one's still dealing with a real world, but you are very much stepping into uncharted territory. So, and if that's, come on, don't be shy. If that, no, don't go there, I don't want these diamonds. If that is true of music, if that is true of consciousness, then as some of you may be interested to discuss, that is very probably true of religion as well. So I'll finish there, if that's okay, Dennis. Sorry, 2 minutes over. But, and if there are questions, then I'll obviously do my best to deal with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Good. So I'm sure that's stimulating plenty of questions. And the first one is over here. Yes. So.
Given the high degree of convergence, both at cognitive level and molecular level, do you think we can call one species superior to other, as we generally tend to?
Gosh. Yes and no. Well, how does one begin to start? The more superior you become, let's put it this way, and I'm not an ethicist by the way at all, I'm a philosopher monke, but the more superior you become, the more your responsibilities grow. So effectively, especially in science, the more we understand about the world, the more remarkable we find it. But in that sort of way, if the world is deemed, due to our interference, to be relatively fragile, which I think would be a fair point, then one takes additional responsibility for that. So in a certain way, yes, I think I have a more interesting cognitive life than a cat would. In fact, I know that about as sure as I know anything, but that's another story. But in any event, dogs different, that's another story, because we're symbiotic with dogs. In that sort of way, don't you believe that? In that sort of way, yes, there is. If you use loaded words like scala naturae and so forth, or if you have this sort of idea that somehow one can end up looking down on things, I think that would be utterly mistaken. And of course, as you might agree, in certain hands, the idea of some sort of racial superiority in particular has been exercised several times in living memory to absolutely disastrously, to put it mildly, in that sort of way. So they're loaded words, and they're ones which need to be used with extraordinary caution, would be the sort of way. The only other thing I would stand back slightly is that, of course, in evolution generally, there are many fascinating examples of what, from our perspective, we call simplification. There are groups of animals, for instance, mixozoans and one, which have basically reinvented themselves as protistans. And what one will probably find, and I don't think anybody's invested, actually there is some evidence in that area, you'll probably find they've reinvented themselves because there is a very good way of being that sort of protistan. And if you look at the organisation even of something like a ciliate, they are fantastically complicated. I mean, let alone a cell. I mean, if you think, well, in a certain sense, I'm superior. Well, yes, because I can understand that. But in terms of biological organisation as a whole, in terms of cellular organisation, it is astonishing how a chemical factor that size, which goes far beyond the concentrations which any chemist would allow, enables these things in terms of enzymes and so forth to actually operate. So that's a rather vague reply, but in a sense, I think one really wants to reposition oneself entirely in that sort of discussion. So I don't know if that's really adequate for you. But
okay, well, keep it over there. Yes, Simon. Yeah. So,
do you think artificial intelligence is possible using some form of non-biological system?
Well, it should be. It's just proved fantastically difficult. I mean, if you want to make artificial intelligence, you need to go and marry and have a baby. It's very, very straightforward. It's done all the time. It works rather well by and large. I don't quite understand why it's been so unsuccessful. I mean, I'm not an AI person, and it does seem at first sight to be rather sort of strange, because presumably I mean, as you probably gathered, what I was hinting at is my own sense is that, and I've used this in other talks and other sorts of contexts, it's not work in progress, it's madness in progress, but my sense now is that the brain is much more of a sort of, and this is very much an extremely vague way of trying to put it, but it's effectively an antenna. It's something which is embedded in a much wider reality than one which we are readily prepared to take on board at the moment for various reasons. And actually, I think there's actually some fairly good evidence of that in any case, in various lines. But if that was the case, or even if you were just simply to subscribe to the idea that it is simply a molecular arrangement which would find some analogue in a nanotechnology, then in principle it shouldn't be terribly difficult. So I'm rather puzzled as to why it appears. I mean, again, I'm not an expert in that area. It ought to be very straightforward. But the success has been, to put it mildly, disappointing. But I can't see in principle why, there may be something very curious about carbon organisation, why an in silico version can't work. Yeah, I don't know, but I think just trying to make a brain, per se, is not the way to do it.
okay, we'll go Francis.
So I want to ask about language. You've nicely outlined the numerous ways that vocalization has evolved in multiple independent pathways and is capable, obviously, of sending important signals from the vocalizer to the recipients of that, whether it's a whale or a songbird. But I think most people would say that the one aspect of humanity that has allowed exceptional success is a much more sophisticated form of language that allows syntax and nuances and many complex messages to be conveyed in a short period of time. For humans, there is some possible genetic claim that FOXP2, this recently evolved gene, may play a role in that, and that people who have mutations in that gene have great difficulties with language. But how come this has not appeared, especially in other organisms that do have substantial brain capacity? Or is it that we're just not seeing the evidence that it has appeared, and we're not capable of actually perceiving the sophistication of the communication because it's not in the form that we recognize?
I think it's actually a lot of the latter. In fact, I mean, animals are very adept at communicating in all sorts of ways, and there's a sort of proto-language in certain vervet monkeys and so forth in which they do articulate different dangers with different calls and the like. And I think, again, one needn't underestimate, even in terms of our own communication. I mean, an enormous amount of communication, again, is done with, quote, body language and so forth. But on the other hand, I entirely agree with you. We have the syntax, we have the grammar and everything else. And again, I think one aspect of that, which again, it's work in progress so far as it's work at all, is that if you look at dolphins, Louis Herman's famous experiments whereby you give the dolphin a series of instructions, which you can do either by hand signals or underwater sounds, and it goes and does the right thing. Dolphins, pretty smart creatures. You then give them exactly the same words in a different order, which means something completely different. So you're then changing the syntactical structure. They're going to do the right thing. So they can deal with semantics and syntax, but they just don't use it themselves. And the more, as you'll know as a geneticist and my own limited area of knowledge and evolution, is the more you look at not only animals but organisms as a whole. I mean, the difference between us is paper thin. I mean, everybody knows that in a sort of sense, but the more you study these things, there's nothing worth talking about. I mean, now you may persuade me, and I'd be happy to be persuaded, the genome project on the chimp will tell us everything we want to know. No.
Tell us a few things.
Yeah, of course. But again, here, this is completely off wall in terms of the science. I'm very influenced in terms of theory of language by work of Owen Barfield in particular. And my sense is that inasmuch as there is a universal grammar, most probably, when you're beginning to enter these new cognitive worlds, then you start to discover other realities. And one of those realities is the thing which we use as language. Though, in point of fact, again, if you talk to poets and so forth, and if you talk to people who write, as often as not, I mean, there are lots of sort of analogues and similarities, but for example, and I don't think this is entirely trivial, very frequently when people say they're writing a novel, somebody walks in, out of their mind, into the novel and takes over part of that novel. Now, you can always say, yes, well, it's in his head, isn't it, or her head. It may be so. But one can actually stand back slightly further and say, well, if indeed the way in which the cosmos is organised is just slightly more complicated than it appears to be the case, it may be the case that such things as vocalisation, such things as syntax, will have an entirely scientific explanation from our present perspective in terms of future investigation. I mean, that's perfectly all right. That's the way we play the game. That's the way we keep on moving things forward. But when you come into these areas where one has difficulties, which at the moment seem to be peculiarly intractable, when you have other traditions which have been broadly neglected, yet seem to have their own veracity, then you may be entitled to say that there's more in common than some people would be prepared to admit. I'm trying to use my words as carefully as possible. So I think in the case of language, it's not simply, and like the fox gene, that family has lots of other defects as well. I mean, clearly it's an unhappy group of people, relatively speaking. There's some connection there, yes. But even if you look at things like the descended larynx, for instance, I mean, that is convergent in various cats, it's convergent in the deer. There's no particular problem making these sounds. If you look at the formant structure in parrots, the lingual articulation parrots use, they use a syrinx rather than the vocal tract we have. But the formant structure is convergent. If you get a minor bird or a parrot to mimic, they're superb, but they don't read books. I mean, even teaching them. As somebody said with regard in another context, with all this thing trying to teach these chimps things, chimps have nothing to say. So, yeah, I mean, it is work in progress, but I think, we may have to stand slightly further back with some of the received wisdoms at the moment.
Yes, question here.
Yeah, I don't know whether to ask you this question or Dr. Frank Collins, but but any of you can answer. There has been a proposition that if a Nobel laureate marries another, you are likely to produce a dump. A dump. Yes. Is that true? Can that be true?
In other words, if we're intelligent, the Americans have a rather rude term for it, but then we muck things up. Yes, but that may be the case for many reasons.
Why?
It's many reasons, partly because most of us are extremely greedy. For instance, most of us are using far more than we ought to use. If you saw my air miles, you wouldn't believe it. If that's one sort of answer to that. Most of us eat too much. I don't deny that. Most of us consume far too much. Most of us are highly aggressive in their interactions with other people, especially people we've never met. I mean, there are many ways one could... so I'm not a sociologist or anything like, or a political theorist. But having said all that, I mean, that might be the danger. And in particular, one of the arguments I would have with some of my distinguished secular colleagues is that, and this may not be the area which is worth going into, is that they refuse, if you think of people like Grayling or Dawkins, for instance, I think it'd be fair to say that they will not engage in radical evil. It's just, somehow a thing. Yes, it sort of happens, sort of thing. Whereas if you take a metaphysical view on this, then you can sort of say, well, it may not be a great deal we can do about it, but once we recognise it, then we can do something about it. And I think in the particular case of science, although it often has a bad press, there are aspects about the scientific exploration which are utterly astonishing. And similarly, even in the case, let us say, of global warming, we don't know, first of all, just how serious the danger is. Everyone's getting on their high horses at the moment. But it may not be as bad as people think. But we can do things about it. We're not stupid. And of course, in a way, the argument about why humans live in a lonely universe is that, if I'm correct with my argument to do with convergence, yes, indeed, intelligent species bubble up continuously in a galaxy, but they always destroy themselves. They make a dump of it. They make the place uninhabitable. And that could happen. I think it's unlikely to happen all the time. But I say we are intelligent. We are sometimes very good. We can make the wise decisions. We can be led wisely. I don't want to get sort of too romantic about this, but I wouldn't actually, in that way, subscribe to such a dismal view as a Nobel laureate would be. I mean, one needn't be sort of just ludicrously cheerful. But people are open to argument. People are aware of what's going on. People aren't always quite as selfish as they appear to be. So, I wouldn't be, I mean, we'll meet in 30 years' time and discuss what the answer is.
Right. Yes, there's a question over here.
Okay. You talk about the independent existence of cognitive landscapes, such as music and consciousness and even religion. Are you using this in the same way as the mathematicians do in the Platonic realm of maths being an independent reality? Is this what you mean?
Yeah, effectively so, yes. Well, there are lots of problems. First of all, if I understand it correctly, roughly half of mathematicians think that they are working things out in their own head. They think that effectively any system they arrive at is one of an almost infinite number which anybody else could have arrived at in one sort or another. The other half are far more persuaded that there is an external reality which they're discovering. And that would be broadly the way I would also want to describe it. The reason I would be slightly wary, though your question is bang on the mark, about the word archetypes, is especially in biology, it's a very loaded term. Because it's effectively a pre-Darwinian term. It was one which in the end became the sort of trump card for people like Owen versus Darwin in particular. And my off-the-cuff remark about the sort of crystallization of biological form when I was talking briefly about the two main groups of birds, excluding the fowls that is in a sense to use that terminology without using the dreaded A word in terms of the archetypes. That's right. The other reason why one I think has to be slightly careful is that so far as Neo-Platonism goes per se, it's a very powerful metaphor for the organisation of life. But I think in terms of any theological discourse, at least certainly in Judeo-Christian tradition, Neo-Platonism does not get you very far. It's fine as it goes, but it's not. That crystalline structure you see is something which does not reflect what I would see the world, by the world I mean the universe in a sense, in terms of not only its fructification, its fruitfulness, but also the way in which it continues to develop on itself. So you start with a rather uninteresting substrate of things, and each time you get to another level of organisation, whether it be a cell or the normal hierarchy you see in biology, the things which emerge from that not only are more remarkable, more beautiful, and, well, in a sense, more superior to what we saw beforehand, but actually keep on discovering new potentialities of the world about them, which is why I think the arguments to do with music and with consciousness are so interesting. They're not simply in our heads anymore.
Okay.
So that's a sort of answer. But there is a very strong Platonic element in that. You're absolutely correct, yes.
Yes.
Early on in your talk, you emphasized the mistakes that occur in evolutionary change, the failures, which are remarkably common. Does the fossil record point to what I could call convergent failure?
Well, again, it's a little bit sort of, you know, these are, and I mean this in no offence, of course. I mean these are value-laden terms of so what do you mean by failure? What one, I think, yes, in that sense you would, but I'm again sort of taking a positive view on it. What one sees, and there's a very nice paper by Dick Bambach and Andy Knoll published about 3 years ago in Paleobiology, on the levels of organisation which one sees. So, for instance, if you look at insect societies, which are extremely interesting for a number of reasons, those by and large appear around about 100 million years ago, give or take. But once you start to get insect societies, if you're talking about wasps or bees or termites or any one of these groups, I mean, the whole world again changes, and all sorts of subtle transformations. Similarly, when you vegetate the land, all sorts of things. So you can always say, well, you know, there's a failure, there's something which has gone extinct. That's you know, in the way of things. But I think that it's more useful in the end to, and it's not an area which I'm well equipped to talk about, but it's more useful to sort of think about the systems as a whole. You know, in a sense, it's going back to thinking of how do you make a mess of things. Well, once you recognise that you're embedded in an ecology, again, this is all very sort of trendy. This is very trendy speak 20 years ago. But in that sort of aspect, there's the idea of failure. And again, I'm certainly not trying to push you into a corner you've no intention of occupying. But there's something of a sort of individualistic view of that. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, you know, that when things go to the wall, then they themselves evolved independently several times.
Yes, I was thinking of, you've given us many convincing examples from the whole range of the animal kingdom of two different groups which have produced some convergent feature which you've identified.
Yeah, sure.
Now, is the reverse true? I mean, the Irish
I'm
elk
sorry.
produces these huge antlers, which is its undoing. Does that kind of thing occur many times?
No, it doesn't really. No, actually, I mean the huge antler story is very probably just one to do with sexual selection, and that's a roaring success, I can assure you. There are remarkably few, if I can give you a very rude example, but I better not, to do with the baculum. There are various sorts of things which we, from a human perspective, might regard as extremely problematic, but most of them don't turn out to be. I mean, the idea that, and I'm not again saying you're trying to espouse that idea for a moment, but the idea that there are certain trajectories of evolution, sorry, I probably slightly misunderstood your first question, that's my fault, where you get onto a sort of an orthogonal conveyor belt, where you an orthogenetic conveyor belt rather, where you're doomed to go extinct. You know, the antlers are mother getting bigger and bigger. I can't stop it. You know, help me. Any one of those. I mean, the point. Let me try and rephrase it very slightly. To the first approximation, in my view, this is not shared by all neo-Darwinians, especially people like Gould, is that the organisms you're dealing with are superbly adapted for what they're meant to do. The degree of sophistication, you know, take a tuna in one context, you take a low Reynolds number bacterium, and like the preciseness of the organisation to live in the given habitat is astonishing. And actually, in that way, nature is extremely unforgiving. You know, as I say, in a certain, I could give you examples from respiratory proteins, for instance, but to the first approximation, most of life is actually walking along a knife edge. On either side, as we've used this metaphor elsewhere, is a complete chaos. You know, they are completely uninhabitable areas. So the reason why you get convergence is because there are so few roads along which you can navigate. if you go off, and indeed, there are abortions, so to speak, in relative sense. There are things which are non-functional. They do not survive for any length of time at all. So that's really the thing. What's the critical point is, though, that, as I was saying in answer to the question just beforehand about the sort of Platonic archetypes and the landscape of potentiality, which I don't think is reflected in archetypes. What you get in organisations such as ourselves, but possibly even in much more primitive forms, including not only plants but quite possibly bacteria, are levels of emergence which we can study and say, oh yes, they're bound to happen, but at least at the moment have no predictability. So part of the argument to do with convergence is that if we can begin to find some general principles, then even though we understand our biosphere moderately well, there may be all sorts of biological organisations which we regard as animals as being effectively inert for all intents and purposes, which are not. Okay, so what matters, and I mean the most obvious case, which goes back to Francis's point about the language, is that how and why and whenever we've stumbled on language, and there's another set of stories, but actually there are a few straws in the wind to suggest that language is extremely late. I mean, it could even be as recent as 150,000 years ago. And communication beforehand, yes, definitely, beyond a shadow of doubt. Pass me the spear. But the real, what we call the real language, may be very, very recent. And so once you stumble into those new worlds, and especially language, again, another friend of mine was saying, somebody asked him, what are the two most important things in evolution? He said the Cambrian explosion and language. So once you go into that new world, then I say all bets are off. Which is why, the question about, are we going to muck up everything is extremely important, because we understand what's going on. Definitely, it's very, very important indeed to get it right.
Yeah, question back there.
So biological evolution is a machine for generating organisms that discover God, and there will be descendants of ours that will perceive and know him more intimately than we do at the moment.
I wouldn't assume that. I mean, that's a legitimate statement to debate. I have no quarrel with that at all, because if I'm using the metaphor of a search engine, and if one's using the notion that all that you see around us is not all that there is, which again would be entirely familiar to any theist, then there's certainly the possibility that one will discover things which are, to put it mildly, surprising. But I wouldn't put any promissory note on the future. There are plenty of examples of civilizations, notwithstanding my comment I was making earlier, where things have not gone well at all. And even in the case, as I said, deliberately chosen to happen. There's a wonderful book I highly recommend to you by John Lucas called The Jewel, which is about the 80 days and the difference in the characters between Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill. It's absolutely gripping. And if we'd fouled up then, we would probably be in today in Europe it would be ghastly beyond belief. But yes, I mean there's every reason to be optimistic in that sort of way. But one has to throw away some well-received assumptions. Sorry about that. Not for you, but my friends in North Oxford.
I'm going to ask a question then, since I'll ask the last question before we break for tea break. I don't know if I need that up there. Do I need that up there? So I think, Simon, from what you were saying earlier, you're generally somewhat suspicious about the possibility of there being intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, which would actually survive long enough, and so forth. I mean, is that correct? Do you have what is your view about the evolution of intelligent life somewhere else in the universe? It's just biologically very, very, very unlikely.
I think, biologically, I think it should be inevitable. Right. It, of course, presupposes that we understand rather more competently than we presently do how life originates, but that's not exactly been a success, but no doubt an explanation will come out, I'll say, soon. But it's more that the formation of extrasolar planetary systems depends on stars which are the product of earlier stars. In other words, they've got to be, quote, as an astronomer would say, be relatively metal rich, by which they have more elements, just helium and hydrogen. And metal rich stars, from what I understand, begin to become quite abundant around about 4 billion years ago. So you've got to go through several cycles of star making before you you have enough nuclear synthesis effectively to start to make not only particular stars but particular planetary systems. There's just not a lot of iron around to begin with because you've got to make stuff. Now the problem there is that if I'm right and there are various planetary systems which have a head start of 4 billion years, and if we're right about the spread of our technology and the speed with which that happens, then those sorts of things that we're discovering ourselves at the moment are in the blink of an eye. They're instantaneous. You know, what I say, when all bets are off, and the bet started to be getting a bit wobbly, I think 100,000 years ago, and by 40,000 years ago there was no turning back at all. So if that's the case, then you've got this sort of paradox of having these infinitely short periods of time when things do happen, and then immense periods of time when anybody who's in a position to occupy a galaxy has got, you know, they wouldn't worry about us. You know, we wouldn't be here again. So that's where I think the paradox lies. I think it's less likely that civilizations, you know, self-destruct. I think most people have, you know, believe it or not, actually have a vested interest in the thing keeping going. I mean, you know, obviously some people are less optimistic at the moment, but I think the way the world's changing at the moment, I mean, there's a great deal of friction, a great deal of unhappiness. We know perfectly well where some of the tender points are, but most people realise that in the end they are one species.
So the president of the Royal Society estimating that we, humanity, only have a 50% chance to get through the present century, you think is unnecessarily gloomy?
Far from it for me to disagree with Lord Rees of Ludlow. He says, or Martin, as I know, is my friend. No, but I think Martin would have to be here to defend himself. I mean, quite frankly, I think he's effectively used metaphysics of assumptions. He is effectively a pessimist, I think it would be fair to say. I don't have any quarrel with that. He may be right, and of course he is a highly intelligent man, and there are straws in the wind which are not encouraging, beyond a shadow of doubt. But on the other hand, both of us are scientists. He's an extraordinarily distinguished scientist, a brilliant man. And one should not necessarily sort of throw away all the cards, even when they're looking like a rather poor hand.
I think that's a good moment at which to break for tea, isn't it? So let's thank Simon again very much for his talk.